Good morning everyone, or whatever time it is where you are. It's morning here, and so I'm making a coffee and I'm gonna have some breakfast, and we're gonna talk about online teaching taboos and some individual situations that happened in my classroom last week. Okay, we'll let that fry away, my egg, and I've got bacon, and I'm gonna make an egg and bacon wrap. But online teaching taboos. So, recently I've seen several posts in the Facebook groups about, sensitive subjects that come up, and honestly, I see these time and time again because they happen, right? Kids bring things up. Kids know about politics in the US, or, situations going on around the world, or there's, topics that are really relevant to the time that we're living in. And so these come up, especially as children, progress in their English abilities, they're able to communicate more, ask questions, and they're just genuinely curious about what we as foreigners, might think about certain situations. You want to be really careful about topics that are going to be controversial, or that, students are not going to maybe have the same beliefs as you do, or things like that. And not to say that you shouldn't talk about things where you don't agree on things, but generally during your online classes, try to stay clear of topics that are going to be controversial and that may not, sit well with students and their families if they were to hear you talking about those things. It goes without being said that online teaching is extremely different than, teaching in a brick and mortar classroom, where you're probably teaching students from the same culture as you, maybe, obviously the same country that you're living in, and you're able to engage in topics quite differently than you're going to be when you're teaching in an online classroom. And so I want you to understand the difference between those two, and how, teaching online is not a place or space for bringing up taboo, controversial, and sensitive issues. Now, when those topics come up, which they certainly could, and they certainly do from time to time with our students, it's important that we know how to deal with them, and that we can sort of move past them quickly without causing too much of an issue. I teach online, English online to Chinese students, and there are certain taboo topics when teaching Chinese students. We should never talk about what I've heard referred to as the 3 T's, which are, Tiananmen Square and the issues surrounding that, Taiwan and the territory issues around that, also Tibet as well, and especially Hong Kong. So regions that are controversial to Chinese people and to the rest of the world, where there might be disagreements as to what region belongs to what country, or whether a region is a country or a part of another country. Those are definitely taboo topics that you don't want to bring up in your online ESL classroom, especially when teaching Chinese students. So, certain taboo topics that you want to avoid in your classroom, or certain sensitive issues that you want to avoid, are things like religion. You don't want to be talking about religious topics with students. You're able to share your cultural traditions with students, but avoid imposing beliefs or sharing belief systems in your classroom unless it's from sort of an educational perspective, or if you're learning about that in your lesson, because there certainly are lessons where we learn about different religions, and there's nothing wrong with letting students know, you have a particular religion, but it's when it starts to become imposing and, starting to get your own opinions into there, that would be what I want to avoid. As well, you want to avoid politics, especially in these days. We don't want to bring up political issues with our students. We're not there to talk about political issues. We're there to talk about English with them and teaching them English and having conversations with them. As well, stay clear of things like gender roles, where gender roles are different in different countries. As well, you want to stay away from things like wars, unless of course it's from an educational perspective, sexuality, gay rights, things like that really are better left undiscussed, especially if you have different opinions I think there's ways of talking about those things without it being controversial or maybe, you know, something that's going to upset a student, or maybe if a student doesn't agree with something. So you want to be careful with that. Marriage relations, so some kids are going to be coming from single parent homes, and this is a sensitive topic, so try to be careful and tiptoe around things like that related to marriage. Mental health as well, you want to avoid this one, of course. Mental health is a big issue, but this is not something that we want to get into with our students in our 25-minute lessons, okay? Abortion, of course, you're going to leave that one alone, whether or not you agree with it. If it comes up in a classroom, I would just kind of dance around that topic and move on. And I'll talk about how I would deal with these situations when they come up, because a couple of them did come up for me last week. Domestic violence, you know, of course, if you see domestic violence or you're suspicious of that in your classroom, it's best not to bring it up in the class. You can certainly send tickets in to the company and let them know what you're concerned about. But again, our job is not to deal with that on an individual level in our classes. Same thing for suspected child abuse and things like that. Racial inequality, this is something that does come up from time to time in our classes, especially with images and topics, and you want to be careful that you are not getting too into that debate with any of your students. All right, breakfast has been eaten and the coffee has been poured, and before I get into the situations that happened in my classroom last week, I wanted to say that snapshot of taboo topics and, you know, subjects that can come up in our classroom and ways that we can deal with them, you know, are varied. I mean, there's lots of different ways you can handle situations, and when something like that comes up, we're not always going to have the exact perfect response, or, you know, sometimes we're caught off guard and we don't know the right way of dealing with something. If you're uncomfortable, it's best to just change the subject. I think that's the easiest way to do that, or you could say something like, you know, I'd rather not talk about that in class. You can talk to your parents about that. However, sometimes things come up and we do respond, and sometimes we respond the wrong way, or we don't have the right words to say. And I was not ready for these two situations that happened, and they happened honestly days after each other. The first one was, I was doing a lesson with a student on traveling, and we were talking about countries that they have traveled to. And so I asked the question to the student, what countries have you traveled to? They sort of struggled with the response, and I gave them ideas. I said, like Japan or like Korea. And then I said, have you been to a country like Taiwan before? I don't know if I said it in exactly that way, but the student was 11 years old and she looked quite taken back by that. And she said, teacher, Taiwan is China. And so rather than getting into a debate with her about that, which is what you do not want to do, you do want to, you know, acknowledge that and then just move on, which is what I did. So I said something like, oh yes, of course, I know that. I'm asking, have you traveled to Taiwan before? And then she looked a little bit confused by it or whatever, and we just moved along. Then I got a parent feedback. It was 5-apple feedback. It was, you know, positive feedback. She said the class was great, but she said the teacher, well, I'll just pop it up here so you can see. So you can see that the parent definitely didn't like the way I brought it up, or, you know, didn't like how I addressed it. And, you know, understandably, I made a mistake by using the word country associated with Taiwan. I definitely didn't bring my own opinions into it, whether I think Taiwan is its own country or not. I just left it as it was. But, you know, I think it was a lesson for me to think about, or be more careful, I guess, in those kinds of topics. It's never happened to me before, but I can guarantee you it won't ever again. So you do want to be, you know, learn from those situations and just try to do better next time. The second story comes from a student that I was teaching about Martin Luther King Jr. And immediately as the slide popped up, he took the pen marker and he scribbled all over Martin Luther King Jr. and said something like, he's ugly or something. So I knew where this was going, and I decided to, you know, say that what I said was, we don't treat people like that in this classroom, and that's not very nice. I cleared the screen and I moved on to the next slide. 2 or 3 slides down, there was another picture of a group of people of color, and we were talking about, you know, what Martin Luther King Jr. did for the world, etc. And he scribbled out all of the people of color and, you know, kind of made like a smirk on his face. So I cleared the screen and I addressed him and I said, this is not appropriate. This is not how we treat people. Please do not do this in our lessons. And as I moved through the lesson, you know, he didn't say anything more about it. And I tried to pose questions to him that were to get him to think about, you know, how we all want to be treated equal. And it doesn't matter what color you are or who you are. We're all people of value and deserve to be treated equally. So I think he sort of got the point through the lesson, but had I been a little bit more prepared with those tools in my toolbox in that moment, I might have put it more onto him as a way for him to reflect on how would you feel if you were that person and someone was treating you that way. Just because they are a person of color doesn't make them any less valuable. You know, and it just got me thinking about all the different types of topics that could come up in our online classrooms and how to deal with them. While these situations are fairly rare, and as I said, I've taught over 5,000 classes, and these are the only two that I can think of situations that were controversial that have come up. So it is rare, but it's important to kind of be thinking about that in advance and, you know, how you might respond to different situations, especially as you're previewing a lesson. You could, you know, anticipate certain questions or opinions or things coming up because of the lesson. So, lesson of the story, it's good to think about those situations. We're not always going to be prepared with the correct response, but we can only do our best. My biggest tip for you is to not engage in any of those controversial topics. Move along and continue to do what you're there to do, which is to teach students and to teach them English. So I would love to know in the comments, have you ever had issues like this come up, topics, taboo topics related to your online classes? Let me know in the comments below. How did you deal with them? I'm sure we can all benefit from that. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. I would love to see you around again, and have a great day and happy teaching. Hey there, don't go anywhere just yet. See that subscribe button? Click subscribe and the bell for notifications and watch those videos about online teaching and building a brand and business. I'll see you in the next one.